Of the cases already tried, at least 16 of the Christians were sentenced to active terms of imprisonment, while some of the appeals in cases of active prison sentences led instead to suspended sentences. Several of the Christians were imprisoned. Hamid Soudad was released in July after serving 2.5 years in prison under a 5-year prison sentence. All bar a small number of the prosecutions have been under Ordinance 0603, enacted in 2006, which sets out the conditions and rules of practice of quote-unquote non-Muslim religious rituals. In just the last 9 months alone, the Algerian authorities have initiated prosecutions against at least 23 Christians connected with the peaceful practice of their faith. Those prosecuted and sentenced have included the most senior leaders of the Église Protestante d'Alger, the association representing most Protestant churches in Algeria, also known as the EPA. Reverend Yusuf Urrahman, vice president of the EPA, established this month that he was sentenced in his absence to 2 years in prison on charges of holding an unauthorized religious assembly and of holding worship in a building that does not have a permit for worship. The sentence is not currently enforced, pending his appeal, which is scheduled for hearing on the 19th of November. This month is to overall see first instance court hearings in the cases of 8 Christians. The charges laying in those cases carry various terms of imprisonment. The charges on a per charge basis carry sentences of up to 5 years in prison. The campaign of targeting has been escalating seriously, as evidenced by the said at least 23 new prosecutions in the last 9 months and the at least 12 further church closures in the last 11 months alone. Since November 2017, the authorities have acted to close Protestant churches. As of then, at least 42 churches have closed. Only a small minority of Protestant churches remain open in Algeria. With concern alone to Protestant churches that are registered with the EPA, only 4 of the more than 40 such churches have not been closed and are currently operational. It has been reported that during interrogations, interrogators have declared the authorities aim to close all of these churches. The authorities claim church buildings are used illegally for worship since they lack permits required under the aforementioned Ordinance 0603. The ordinance stipulates a permit must be obtained before using a building for non-Muslim worship. However, the churches have never been able to obtain the said permits despite applications, since the commission responsible for these permits has not issued even a single permit to a church since the ordinance was enacted in 2006. Churches have closed chiefly through the issuance of formal orders for closure, either issued by a court or provincial governor. Several have closed due to other forms of pressure from the authorities, including verbal demands to close from police forces, and a number have closed due to the pressure and fear of anticipated targeting, anticipated arbitrary detention, and the closure of the churches in any event, with church officials and communities being scared of what lies ahead. They wish only to be allowed to practice their faith peacefully and to be free to join together to peacefully express their faith, free from the threat of lengthy interrogations and sometimes violent, abusive, and threatening behavior from police forces, and free from the threat of being treated as criminals and imprisoned. Algerian Christians and Christian communities are and wish only to be peaceful and law-abiding, and they ask only that their rights under the law be recognized and protected, not violated, including as to the right to freedom of religion or belief and the right of freedom of peaceful assembly. Given the ongoing and escalating serious violations and the Protestant Church being forced towards extinction, there is a real and pressing need for government officials and parliamentarians across all regions of the world and institutions such as the UN and its officials through various means to continue to raise these violations and to ask that the prosecutions against Christians in connection with the peaceful practice of their faith, that they cease, and that all churches will be permitted to reopen that have been closed, and the applications from churches for permits allowing Christians to meet in their buildings for worship that they will be processed and granted in a timely manner.
Thank you so much for those insights. I have the pleasure of presenting our next two speakers who will shed light on arbitrary detention in Pakistan. And in this case, these two speakers are right next to me, Joseph Jansen and Shagufta Kausar. Joseph Jansen is founder of Voice for Justice and works for Jubilee Campaign. He's a human rights activist leading important court cases in Pakistan and other countries, as well as compelling reports regarding religious freedom. He has been able, together with a team, to obtain the acquittal of Shagufta Kausar, who has spent 8 years in prison in Pakistan on death row due to blasphemy laws. Shagufta is also joining us today. After being released from prison, she has resettled in Europe, where she is able to share her story of being accused in court of blasphemy, receiving the death sentence together with her paralyzed husband, and subsequently spending 8 years in a small jail cell in Pakistan, not being able to raise her 4 at the time very young children. I'm happy to pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. This side event is an opportunity to shed light on the crucial issue involving arbitrary detention and blasphemy laws in Pakistan and emphasize the urgent need for legal and administrative reforms. The practice of arbitrary detention is a grave violation of human rights. It denies and religious dignity and due process of law. In Pakistan, individuals are detained without clear charges and arrest warrant, without proper legal representation, and without a fair trial by independent judicial inquiry, which makes the detainees face incommunicado and remain imprisoned for several weeks, months, and years. This is not undermines the principle of justice, but also perpetuates a culture of fear and silence. I have Shagufta next to me, who spent 8 years in Pakistan. She was accused of blasphemy in 2013, and she was arrested, and she was sentenced to death in 2014, and she was released by the High Court of Pakistan, Lahore High Court, in 2021, when the resolution was passed at the European Union. Shagufta was merely accused for blasphemy, and a large crowd came and they started, police. A large crowd came and they were shouting for their death. Just a mere accusation that she and her husband, who is paralyzed, said something blasphemy, sent a blasphemous text messages to a clerics, and they came with the mob and police and arrested them in 2013. And this large crowd, clerics, and individuals from the area, Gojra, they were shouting for her death. So Shagufta and her husband spent 8 years. She had at that time 4 minor children from the age from 5 to 12 or 10 years, 12 years old. I want to ask Shagufta, what you want to say, Shagufta, to government of Pakistan, as you were detained for almost 8 years and sentenced to death, and you have spent 8 years in isolation cell, and she survived, and she's with us. What is your message to the world and to the government of Pakistan?
गवर्नमेंट के आगे सबसे पहले मैं ये कहना चाहती हूँ कि जिन लोगों ने मुझे झूठी केस में बंद किया, 8 साल मैं में गुजारे, झूठा इल्जाम, जो लोग मुझसे नफरत करते थे, 8 साल मैंने जेल में गुजारे और बच्चों से दूर रही, मेरे पे जुल्म किया और मैं सजाए मौत की में बंद थी। उन लोगों को मैं अपने दिल से माफ करती हूँ।
She said, I spent 8 years on death row in an isolation cell, and I was falsely accused of blasphemy charges. And I want to forgive the government of Pakistan and those who falsely accused me for blasphemy. I want to forgive them, but I want justice. I want justice for those who are remain in prisons of Pakistan under blasphemy laws.
जो लोग मुझे मारने की कोशिश करते थे और 8 साल मैंने अपने बच्चों से दूर जिंदगी गुजारी, छोटे छोटे मेरे बच्चे थे, उनके लिए मैंने बहुत जो वक्त माँ बाप का था उनको परवरिश करने का या उनको अपना प्यार देने का, वो मैंने जेल में गुजारे.
The time that I was supposed to take care of my children, supposed to help them in their education, in their growth. They were minor children from 5 to 12 years old. So 4 children, they were minor. She left behind, and she said, the time will never come. My children have lost their precious time. They could not study and grow up in their normal education or like other children.
बच्चों की जिंदगी तबाह होगी, खराब होगी.
The life of my children has been destroyed.
कि माँ बाप का उनको प्यार नहीं मिल सका.
They could not get the love of their parents.
इसी के साथ साथ मैं ये कहना चाहती हूँ कि 8 साल जो आगे जो पाकिस्तान में जड़ावाला में वाक़या हो रहा है, उसके लिए मैं अपील करती कि ब्लास्फेमी केस को जो तरीक़ेकार है इसको गवर्नमेंट खत्म करे.
I just want to say that the government must repeal blasphemy laws and the due process must change and reform blasphemy laws, and those who are illegally detained under blasphemy laws must get a fair trial and released from the government of Pakistan. At the same time, as I have very short time, recently in Pakistan there have been 2 incidents recently happened on 16th of August. The incident took place in Geneva, Pakistan, where a mere accusation like somebody did a desecration of Holy Quran in Geneva, Pakistan. A street guy, a person who just put paper on writing some words on the pages of Quran put on the street, and then the cleric, they gathered, they used the loudspeaker of the mosque, calling extremists, calling their fellow Muslims, brothers, to come and gather and take the revenge or take action against the desecration of Quran. So there were thousands and thousands, hundreds of people gathered immediately in Jadawala on 16th of August 2023, in last month, and they attacked on multiple churches where 24 estimated reported church has been destroyed, and almost hundreds and hundreds of churches on 11 different areas has been looted and has been destroyed and set on fire. This is what happened in the last month. And not only this everything happened at the presence of the police. Police was standing there when the mob was attacking, burning the housing, throwing all the stuff from the churches outside from the churches, when they were looting the houses of Christian community, when they were burning the houses of Christian community. The police was standing. Even police came to deliver the message of mob: run away, we can't save your life. So this is the security, this is the situation when it comes to blasphemy laws. People take the law into their own hands. And not only after that, rather than the state should arresting those who were inciting violence on the name of religion, the police has arrested innocent Christians who were affected by these attacks. Police have arrested them, and there have been multiple detainees in Jadawala. There has been children who have been detained. There has been families, women and men who have been detained from last month, several days, under the name of interrogation, investigation. And this is not only Jadawala. In Murray, also Sargodha, the same incident happened. Like in Pakistan, in Sargodha, these extremist Muslims are putting the name of religious phrases on the walls of churches and doors, and then attacking Christians. And multiple people have been detained in Jadawala, dozens of people. And we call on Pakistani government to release immediately these detainees which are illegally detained in Sargodha and Jadawala, and give a fair trial and access to justice who has been accused in Jadawala and Sargodha incident. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you very much for those shocking insights, both into past as well as ongoing challenges, particularly the ones related to arbitrary detention. Thank you especially for Shagufta for her bravery in coming here and in sharing this in person, having gone through these tragic circumstances on a very personal level, both her and her family. Our third speaker today is Rebecca Dow, Montagnard human rights defender with more than 10 years experience in advocacy work for religious freedom and human rights in Vietnam. Her efforts have included working with the Thailand branch of Boat People SOS, as well as serving as a community outreach officer and legal interpreter and translator for the UN High Commission for Refugees. As of 2020, she now works with the People Serving People Foundation in Bangkok. She will guide us into the issue of arbitrary detention on religious grounds in the context of Vietnam. Have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me for this topic, panelists. Today, I would like to focus on the issue of arbitrary detention on religious grounds within the nation of Vietnam. Talking about the arbitrary detention in Vietnam is a topic that would consume a lot of time, since I only have a very short minutes for the speech, so I would only give some short of ground and the situations that the victims face because of their disbelief. Throughout my activism in the field, I have gathered a list of more than 500 prisoners of religious persecutions, mostly Christian from the indigenous community in Vietnam, and mostly are Christians. Most of them were arrested because they were the leaders of church in their community, and they involved in demonstrate to request for freedom of religious in 2002, 2004, 2008, and even recent time there are many Christians being arrested because of their religious freedom. In the other side, I also involved in helping some Catholics and Buddhists and Catholics believers to observe and monitor their persecution towards this religious group as well. For the arrest, the victims are arrested based on the religious manifest. To the authorities, worshiping God is an action that believers operate against the authority policies in Vietnam. Their religious activities are accused of being reactionary. Most of the time, the government persecutes believers because they practice religious rituals and celebrates religious events with groups or congregations that have not been recognized or permitted by the authorities. And many independent churches are targeted by the authority in the present times. They are being persecuted, harassed, and many documents, like documentations, are not included in the reports that nowadays that we haven't really get to know about. And during the congregations practice and celebrate religious rituals, the authority also interrupt, for example, Christmas in 2020 of a ethnic minority Christians in the central of Vietnam. So the government arrested 11 Christians and confiscated some offering money from the church, and also destroyed their Christianity's documents and the music instruments which they used to worship their God. Many believers are accused of by the government of being dictatorial for using the reason of worshiping to engage in political activities against the state. What we could really easily see that it is the government that is taking advantage of religious issue to oppress the people, not the believers using religious to overthrow the government. Some young believers were banned from leaving the country to participate in religious conference that taking place outside of the country. Upon stopping them from leaving the country. Their documents, identity has been confiscated. They have been detained for a few days, questioned, and the authority has physically impact on the victims. I would say he tortured the victims in order to get the statement from them. And the other ground is that having connection to NGOs, churches, or foreign delegations, and some people who live abroad has also been used as an accusation to arrest and imprison believers by the authorities. Specifically, most recent event was taking place on the 22nd February 2023. The General Consulate of America visit some churches in the Central Highland of Vietnam were harassed by the authority, and some believers, some church leaders even threat to be imprisoned in front of the officer from the US Embassy. And the other reason is to attend online training in international law, civil society law, religious belief law, Article 18. Also a trigger keys to causing victims in arbitrary detention by the authority. Many independent churches are failed to request for permissions to practice their religious activities based on which we have no idea what's the reason why that they give the victims for not recognize them and recognize their church and allow them to practice their religious activities. The victims are often sentenced under Article 331, Clause 2 of the Criminal Code, or under Article 116 of the Criminal Code. And the victim are sentenced very long imprisonment term. This is also what we could say that the government using this long-term imprisonment to also deter other human rights activists or religious activists to stop people promoting for their religious freedom. In the most recent cases that we have been reported, many Christians got arrested, specifically the case of preacher Nay Blanc, Ivonia, and preacher Craig. Three of them have been sentenced a very long time in the prisons, and specifically Craig Bunya and Ivonia previously was arrested and sentenced to 9 years in prison, and this was the second time of them being arrested because of they open church for their congregations and learn how to practice their religious rituals in the community. And specifically in the indictment of Mr. Ivonia also shown that the representative of the US Embassy and the Consulate General in Vietnam met Mr. Ivonia in Pleiku City, and this is also listed on his verdict in June 2020. And when the victims are arrested or summoned, the authority forced them to follow religious organizations that had been recognized and permitted by the state, meaning they are not allowed to practice their religious activities or being with their previous congregation, and being targeted by the authority and threat if they get back to their congregation. And the other thing the other form is force them to renounce their religious belief in order to trade for their freedom. And they often do not provide representative lawyers to defend the case at the court. So beside that, the relatives and friends of the victims are not allowed to attend the court hearing and sentence them say that very long imprisonment, and threat the victim's family and did not allow them to connect with the outsiders to provide information about the arrest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that statement. It really highlights the ways in which arbitrary detention connects with many other rights violations in different ways, and the multiplicities of ways in which there's a need to protect religious minorities in particular on this issue. Our next speaker will be Andy Mulder, whom you saw in the beginning, who is an experienced human rights specialist, and she will comment on the practice of arbitrary detention within the framework of international human rights legislation. As a brief introduction, from 1991 to the present time, Andy Mulder has served as Executive Director of Jubilee Campaign USA, focusing on international religious freedom advocacy, including for the release of prisoners of conscience, the resettlement of refugees, combating trafficking, the protection of children, and providing support to victims. She also founded the law firm Just Law International in the United States and is a practicing lawyer. And Bualda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jonas. And I would like to thank all of those who've already spoken and shared their testimony of what has happened in their country with regards to arbitrary detention. Today, I address a matter of grave concern, one that strikes at the very core of our shared values as upholders of international recognized fundamental human rights. The title of this event is Faith in Captivity, Arbitrary Detention in the Name of Religion. Arbitrary detention for religious reasons is a reprehensible practice that not only undermines fundamental rights and principles of human dignity and freedom, but also represents a blatant violation of fundamental human rights. Among others, Article 9 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 9 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provide that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary detention in contravention of international law and obligations. Having laws that restrain a person's religion or beliefs is too often used as a tool by governments to suppress dissent, control populations, and maintain their positions of power. The many examples we've just heard from the testimonies that preceded mine demonstrate that. I want to specifically discuss the detention of individuals who have been imprisoned due to anti-blasphemy or apostasy laws. These laws contravene internationally recognized protections of the individual right of belief choice. In March 2021, led by Australia, more than 50 nations signed on to a joint statement calling on all states where the death penalty remains an available punishment for blasphemy and apostasy to remove the possibility of that penalty being imposed or carried out, both in practice and in law. They must end those penalties. They also urge these states to release individuals currently on death row or otherwise imprisoned for these offenses. Currently, 6 nations maintain the death penalty for apostasy alone: Malaysia, Maldives, Qatar, Somalia, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Additionally, 7 countries maintain the death penalty for both apostasy and blasphemy laws: Afghanistan, Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. It is important to note that in many of these nations where the death penalty is prescribed for apostasy and blasphemy, while the sentences are handed out, prisoners are rarely, if ever, executed. However, individuals who receive such a sentence are left to languish on death row for years, even decades. I want to encourage states to stand behind this worldwide campaign to abolish the death sentence for apostasy and blasphemy laws. And I want to encourage countries to release those detained for apostasy and blasphemy charges. I want to draw your attention to the case of Anwar Kenneth, who remains in prison for more than 20 years in Pakistan. In 2001, authorities reportedly arrested him after he was accused of writing letters perceived as blasphemous towards the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Quran. Kenneth was charged with, quote, insulting the Prophet Muhammad, a violation of Section 295C of the Pakistan Penal Code. He's been behind bars for over 2 decades for expressing his opinion and beliefs. Never mind, he may not have actually wrote the letters, but that's another topic. Over the decades, he has languished forgotten by the legal system without due process of law. This is a stark example of the grave injustices we must continue to address and work tirelessly to rectify. I say that detaining Anwar Kenneth for more than 2 decades violates due process of law because in 2000, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention had found that Pakistan violated due process of law in the case of Ayub Masih, who was convicted of the same penal code, Section 295C. In that case, the UN Working Group confirmed that Pakistan's prosecution for a defendant accused of blasphemy failed to meet international standards of due process of law. And this is also true in the case of Anwar Kenneth. In fact, the Pakistan Supreme Court upheld the same finding that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found and acquitted Ayub Masih. In the same light, the Pakistan Supreme Court needs to acquit Anwar Kenneth. Arbitrary detention for religious reasons is a grave violation of human rights that demands our collective action and unwavering commitment. We must end arbitrary detention in the name of religion and end faith in captivity. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, has just released an updated, detailed report on blasphemy fact sheet and blasphemy law compendium. Its fact sheet shows and lists 95 countries with legislation criminalizing expressions insulting or offending religious feelings, figures, or symbols. Anyone can be caught up in false charges under those broad statutes. It also explains how legislation is inconsistent with international human rights law, protections for the right of freedom of religion or belief, and the right to freedom of opinion and expression. USCIRF states, and I quote, despite blasphemy laws' inconsistencies with international human rights law, they are often defended as a means to achieve peace and religious harmony in society. However, in practice, blasphemy laws are used to promote governmental intolerance and discrimination against religious minority viewpoints. They also encourage individuals and non-state actors to seek retribution against alleged blasphemers. They also, unquote. So last month, as Joseph has already talked about, on August 16 in Pakistan, we saw this very action of non-state actors taking the law into their own hands and seeking retribution with the entire annihilation of the Christian community in Jaranwala, which is near Faisalabad. It's a major Christian community that's been annihilated, not to mention the desecration of the holy book, the Bible, and other Christian religious materials, and the destruction of 24 Christian houses of worship. It's despicable that Pakistan permits this to take place, and their laws endorse it and follow through on it. Therefore, I have the following recommendations. I want to encourage countries to condemn religious detention practice on the international stage using platforms and mechanisms within the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. Last week, Jubilee Campaign and others presented at the UN General Assembly on Yemen. We don't have time today to go into the testimony on that, but we will refer you to testimony which is online, which happened during a parallel session of the UN General Assembly on Yemen. It's important to establish legal aid programs to provide assistance to individuals facing arbitrary detention for religious reasons, including supporting their families, since most often it's the bread earner who is detained under false accusations. We call on the international community to ensure that detainees have access to legal representation and fair trials. We seek for the establishment of mechanisms to monitor and report on cases of religious-based detention, especially in countries with a history of such practices. And finally, we encourage transparency and accountability in the detention process and for swift trials to take place so that people don't languish for decades under false charges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. It was very insightful to hear not only of the specific cases that are ongoing, but also the legal context surrounding them, and in particular, the international obligations states have regarding these cases. Now, in the interest of time, we had one more speaker for whom we had a video statement, but in the interest of time, we will be postponing that. That being said, we will share the link and the statement both in the Zoom meeting as well as with any delegates who may be interested. Would like to spend a little bit of time. First of all, one more big thank you to all the panelists who really helped us to gain an understanding of the big picture perspective on the practice of arbitrary detention and the way it is unjustly employed against persons on the basis of their religion or belief across the world in different regions. We now want to open the floor to questions and answers from the audience. If anyone participating on Zoom wants to pose a question, please raise your hand or type a question in the message box and we can unmute you as needed. I'm also happy to take questions from the floor. So without further ado, are there any questions on the floor? I see Algeria, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks a lot for giving me the floor. First of all, I'd like to think that there are no detainees in Algeria because of their religious beliefs. The freedom of conscience and exercise of religion is guaranteed by the Algerian Constitution in its article number 42 and organized within the law 0602, which constitute the legal framework that sets the conditions and the rules for the exercise of any religion, including Islam. So we cannot open any mosque without a permit. The opening of places of worship, either be a mosque, synagogue, or a church, must receive prior approval from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And here I want to point out that it's the Ministry of Religious Affairs and not Ministry of Islamic Affairs. So it's the Ministry of all religions. Any person who preaches inside a building intended for the exercise of worship must be qualified. The worship must take place in declared and appropriate building. Places of worship do not serve or should not be associated with partisan or political activities.
Sorry, not to cut you off, but it'd be best if we can keep the questions short so there's a chance to respond. Thank you.
But I think it's legitimate also to answer what has been said, no?
We're happy to hear, but we want to give the speakers an opportunity to respond as well as any other questions. So we would ask you to keep it brief. But thank you for your comments.
Thanks.
Was there a specific question you wanted to ask? Or?
I wanted to ask if the person who has spoke about the detainees can tell us for what the weapon is.
I'm happy to pass the floor to Anthony if you want.
I couldn't hear the question, unfortunately.
Happy to
I
repeat
could hear
it.
some of what was said preceding it.
If I understood correctly, was that the question of the basis on which you're making these claims about the persons who are arbitrarily detained in Algeria specifically?
Yeah, well, there are guarantees as provided for. There are provisions under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Algeria is a state party. They concern rights, for example, on freedom of religion and freedom of peaceful assembly. And also there are, as said, there are provisions in the Constitution, but they are not being guaranteed, these provisions, by the Algerian authorities. Instead, the authorities are actively violating the provisions, and it's no good to have provisions as to freedoms in the Constitution, but then to legislate out of them and to effectively annul or cancel them. But either way, whilst they are in the Constitution, but through legislation being opted out of, so to speak, they are also clearly in the ICCPR, which Algeria is a state party to. So, yeah, it's clear that there aren't protections, and rather than there being protections from the state, the state authorities are actively violating these freedoms.
Thank you. I understand. Perhaps that conversation could be repeated in another context. Are there any other questions or on Zoom? Yes, Poland, please.
Poland remains concerned. The religious conflict is continuing. Violence based on religion or belief in different parts of the world. Detention and persecution because of religion or belief should not be placed in the world that is so proudly celebrating universal declaration of human rights. Supporting those unfairly detained was also an idea behind Poland's proposal to establish the International Day commemorating the decades of acts of violence based on religion or belief, which we observe this year for the 5th time. We stand in solidarity with all victims of such acts, recognize the importance of providing them with appropriate support and assistance. I have a question for all of the panelists. So how Geneva-based community may contribute to improve the situation of the people who are detained in your countries because of faith and belief?
Thank you for that question. Were you able to hear that, this panelist online? The question is, how can the Geneva-based community contribute to addressing these cases of violations, particularly in the context of freedom of religion or belief? It's also in the chat. If anyone would like to take the floor, please go ahead.
Sure, this is Anne Bawalda, and what I think the Geneva-based community can do is continue to support resolutions which call for freedom of religion and belief, and in particular that condemn imprisonments and legislation and laws that encourage it. For example, we were very disappointed in July when Pakistan introduced its hate speech resolution, and a majority of UN Human Rights Council members actually voted in favor of it. We would like that vote reversed. As we've seen in today's testimony, what Pakistan introduced is actually not going to solve the problem. It just incites additional violence against the minority communities. And also, it does nothing to end arbitrary detention. So we call upon states to call out those who are in violation of these international standards. And oftentimes it's one case or one incident at a time. We need to speak up about it, and we encourage the international community and also the community there in Geneva to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, in order to close up on time, I would like to stop here, but if there are any further questions, please feel welcome to connect with one of the people here, and we'd be happy to get in touch and discuss these matters further. For now, I just want to give one more big thank you to all the panelists for making the time, the effort to fly into Geneva, but also to join us virtually, to speak on these serious issues from their own experiences and their work. And we would also like to thank all of those who were able to make it today for your participation, for your engagement with us, and hopefully also your continued engagement on these serious issues. Thank you so much, and I wish you a wonderful day.